Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello, Voternomics listeners. Stephanie Flanders here. And it's that time of year where everyone has summer holiday plans, including the three hosts of this show. So to keep things simple, we thought it would be a good idea to offer up a Voternomics summer reading list for the beach, the mountain, or the campaign trail, depending. We've each picked a non-fiction book touching on politics and economics that we thought was worth reading right now. Some of them are fresh off the presses, some a little older. Even if you don't end up reading them, I hope you'll enjoy hearing us talk about them with the author. And for my summer reading selection, I'm speaking with Anne Applebaum about her newest book, Autocracy Inc, The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. Anne is a columnist for The Atlantic and senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University, author of many other books, including Gulag, A History, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and my recent favourite, the best-selling Twilight of Democracy, The Failure of Politics and the Parting of Friends. As that title suggests, the strength of her writing, for me, especially in recent years, comes not only from her unique experience and expertise living and working in Poland, the UK and the US, but the directly personal way she writes about the shift that has happened in the world since, roughly speaking, the fall of the Berlin Wall, as what initially appeared to many of us to be a great flourishing of liberal values and democracy in many parts of the world metastasized into, well, Autocracy Incorporated. And thanks so much for doing this. Opening question, very broadly, tell us what this book is about and why we should be reading it on the beach or anywhere else this summer.
Yes, no, definitely you want to read it on the beach. So first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege to be talking to you. The book is a little bit less personal than my previous book, although it was born out of personal experiences. For many years, I've known people who were active in the Russian opposition, in the Iranian opposition, in the Venezuelan opposition. And in recent years, I've come to understand that much of what they do isn't working anymore. And even though they are popular, they would win. Certainly the Venezuelan opposition would win a free election, and the Iranian opposition are fighting a very, very unpopular government. They are no longer fighting a single dictator in a single country. They're fighting a network of dictators. And the book describes this network. It's not an alliance. It's not an axis. And I don't think we're locked in a new Cold War with them. There's theocratic Iran and Bolivarian socialist Venezuela and nationalist Russia and communist China don't have similar goals, but they do all have similar enemies. And the enemy is us. The enemy is my friends, the democracy or the transparency, the anti-corruption activists. And the reason why is that they see our ideas, and I speak our includes we in the democratic world. We have ideas that would challenge them. And this is the idea of transparency, of accountability, of the rule of law, of rights, of human rights. And all of these things are a challenge to their particular form of dictatorship. And the book describes how that world came to be, and it describes the financial and the propaganda arms of those regimes, as well as some of the military and strategic arms. It's a brief read. I don't know about beaches, but you could certainly read it on a plane or a train. It's meant to make you aware of how it works. And once you see it, I find that you can't unsee it. And I now, almost every day, I pick up a newspaper or I hear a radio program and I think, it's at work again.
There is something about the message of the book when you step back. It is a great read. It's a very easy read. It does open your eyes to a lot of things. But there's something about it that does go against the grain for, say, skeptical journalists who've spent a lot of time trying to douse conspiracy theories or the idea that X or Y sinister global organization is out to get us. Because although you explicitly say there isn't a single sort of James Bond island where they're all sitting and plotting, you are basically claiming that there's these very disparate figures, President Maduro of Venezuela, Prime Minister Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe, and Vladimir Putin, are all working together at some level, united by this desire to defeat a certain set of values.
I repeat, it is not a conspiracy. They don't coordinate their activity, but they do watch what one another does. And sometimes they help one another out. There is no question, for example, that the Venezuelan regime, which probably would have fallen a long time ago, which has been, economically and politically disastrous for what was once the wealthiest country in South America, has been rescued by Russian armaments and weapons, by Chinese investment and Chinese surveillance technology, by Cuban secret policemen, and even with the help of the Iranians. You think about Venezuela and Iran, these are countries that have really nothing to do with one another geopolitically or historically or culturally or in any other way. But they are both countries that are subject to sanctions. They both produce oil, and they have found ways. Iran helps Venezuela break sanctions, and Venezuela has offered visas and other kinds of help, for example, to Hezbollah activists in Europe. So it's not a plot. It's just that they have things in common the way that we, America and Britain, have things in common, and America and France and Germany have things in common, and they act to help one another out and to cooperate. But none of it is a conspiracy. You can see it all on the surface. You do not have to have secret knowledge to interpret it. You don't need access to secret documents. Most of the stuff that connects them, they say it in public, and what they do is visible.
I think the power of the book actually is that is the journalism involved in tracing some of these examples and the way that these different regimes are sort of playing each other's songs. So I wonder if it's worth just giving us one of those examples to show the kind of thing that you're talking about.
Well, one of the examples was, the example of Venezuela and how it's been propped up by the other regimes. I mean, I suppose another example that I use in the book, I talk about the way in which their propaganda is, again, coordinated makes it sound too conspiratorial, but in which they echo and repeat one another. So the Chinese have made a huge investment, tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions of dollars in TV, radio, websites, broadcasting in many, many languages all over the world. Some of it is Chinese state TV and media. Some of it is content sharing arrangements with other organizations, all kinds of investments in Xinhua, which is the Chinese news wire, is cheap or free in many countries. And some of that for a long time has just been the way that's just what the Chinese did to get out their messages about why you should trade with us. And a lot of it was even pretty boring. The Russians simultaneously created this whole system of fake websites. I mean, we got a little glimpse of that in the U.S. 2016 election. And that has also been expanding. It's well beyond fake Facebook posts now. They create fake news organizations that look like they're Ecuadorian or Peruvian, but they're really designed in Moscow and so on. And these systems have been in creation for a while, and you can argue about how important they are. But what interested me was the way in which they were starting to say the same things, and others were as well. And so the story that I trace in the book is the story of the Ukrainian biolabs. I don't know how many of your listeners remember this, but at the very beginning of the Ukrainian war, the Russians made this claim that there were U.S. biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine. And this is not true, and it was proven to be not true. And it was actually the UN Security Council declared that it wasn't true, and multiple international organizations. Nevertheless, you could find that conspiracy theory, that lie was all over Russian media. It was all over Chinese state media. It was therefore picked up by all kinds of African media. It was picked up by the U.S. far right. So Tucker Carlson repeated it on he was then still a Fox News host. There were a couple of, internet figures who put it on Twitter or who put it elsewhere, who got an enormous echo, and it spread very widely. The rumor probably benefited from the recent memory of COVID. People are paranoid about viruses being created in laboratories. And the Chinese were probably eager to promote it because it somehow absolved them of the accusation that they had helped create COVID in a laboratory. It was also designed to muddy the story of the Russian invasion. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a very brutal colonial invasion. It was an imperial invasion of occupation. The occupied territories were treated brutally. There were concentration camps were set up. People were arrested. Children were deported. And all that was somehow muddied by the idea that, well, there are these U.S. biolabs in Ukraine. And I'm not even quite sure I understand the logic of how that explains the war, but it does. It makes it less crystal clear. But the point is that I found this conspiracy theory all over the place. Again, I found it in Venezuela. I found it in Africa. I found it in, as I said, Chinese, Russian, other media. Again, I don't think there were people who sat in a room and said, right, everyone's going to do this. It was just that people saw it coming out of Russia and they repeated it and used it. And that's an example now of how the narrative spread and how they're copied and imitated. And then create a kind of giant echo chamber where you can hear this story about biolabs from lots of different sources.
You were saying at the start that you don't need to have a special conspiracy theory because you can hear it and see it in what they say and what they're doing. But of course, I guess part of the point with campaigns like that is that you can not realize how much an idea is being propagated around the world and through social media because even that is so untransparent.
Yeah, you cannot know where ideas are coming from. And actually, the way that the Russians now often spread ideas or spread narratives is they'll sometimes post something on social media or in a video form, and then it will begin to be repeated, and then they'll take down the original posting. So sometimes they go to great efforts to hide that they are the originators of a particular idea or theory or explanation or story. So, they spend a lot of time thinking about it. They care about it. They put a lot of money into it. Some of this actually, of course, is pretty cheap. And it's hard to measure how much it matters or how much it works. But we did have in the last few months some evidence that it does. And so, for example, one conspiracy theory that went out on Russian media and Russian aligned media and social media in the last year was that President Zelensky had bought 2 yachts, and pictures of the yachts circulated online. And of course, they were not his yachts. They belonged to other people. Nevertheless, the yacht story somehow filtered into the ecosystem. And during the debate on Ukraine aid in the U.S. Senate, apparently some U.S. senators brought up the yachts in their, why should we help Ukraine when the money is going on yachts? I mean, this is completely false, not true. Nevertheless, it had infiltrated the conversation to such an extent that it was part of the American political debate. So if you want evidence that these things matter, that was it.
You have also a great example that's sort of almost comical of a similar dynamic in a much smaller forum where you the story around for the Taiwanese, why the Taiwanese people trapped in a Japanese typhoon had not been rescued when there had been a Chinese coaches coming to rescue them. And then it turns out that all of that completely untrue, but that it had started this whole debate about why does the Taiwanese government not look after its poor stranded tourists. I thought it's just such an obscure thing.
And what was important about that, this was the story that was told to me in Taiwan, what was important about it is that it played into a larger narrative. So the Chinese want to convince the Taiwanese, and they do a lot of information warfare and targeting in Taiwan. They want to convince the Taiwanese that their state is weak, that they don't have any friends, that they're incompetent, that democracy is less efficient, less effective than dictatorship. And that little story about supposedly some Chinese buses rescuing Taiwanese tourists was designed to play into that bigger, larger meta-narrative. And the story became so viral, pushed both by actual Chinese people and by kind of pro-Chinese media in Taiwan, that there was a diplomat connected to the story who killed himself. I mean, it led to a suicide because there was this outcry. Why are we so incompetent? Why can't we rescue our tourists? So these are, again, they can seem like little things, but they're meant to be part of a larger narrative about the stability and success of dictatorship, about the division and degeneracy, sometimes even the sexual degeneracy of democracies. And it's kind of nonstop. So they do it all the time. They frame stories and they tell them in a way that's designed to, destabilize is a wrong word because it sounds too active, but undermine people's sense of security and stability in the democratic world, whether it's Taiwan or Britain or the United States.
You got to know her long before I did, but Audrey Tang, the former digital minister in Taiwan, that was very much the point she was making is not just about the message, but also that it's about making people apathetic and not really believe in government. It doesn't have to be active. I want to move on later to how is this confronted, what you've described, because that's an important bit of the book. But I guess we have to have a bit of a conversation about how Donald Trump fits into this, because it's definitely not a book about Donald Trump, but it certainly feels like it has a lot of resonance for the US election campaign.
I began to write it at a moment when I did not know that Donald Trump was going to be the Republican Party candidate. But I did have some aspects of Trumpism in my head. What Trump has in common with the autocratic world is his transactionalism. So these are regimes that, as I said, they're not knit together by ideology or values of any kind. Instead, they do deals with one another. And this is how Trump thinks. We saw it in his first term when he was still surrounded by people who wanted to keep the U.S. in NATO and wanted the U.S. to remain a leader of the democratic world. I worry that in Trump's second term, those people would be gone. And his natural instinct, which is to do deals with whoever wants to do deals with him for his personal benefit, maybe for the benefit of his friends in the business community, maybe for the benefit of his family, that would be the purpose of his foreign policy, would be to not for the benefit of Americans and certainly not for the benefit of the democratic world, but it would be for him personally. And I was just talking to somebody this morning about what his China policy would be. And she was saying, well, it's very confusing because he says different things, right? Sometimes he sounds very hawkish. Sometimes he says how marvelous Xi Jinping is and how much he admires him. And, my answer to that is his policy will be whatever he decides is most beneficial for him. If he decides the China hawk thing works for him politically or in some other way, he'll do it. And if he thinks it's not going to work for him, he won't. And it's, of course, very hard for policy analysts and maybe even business people to understand when they hear that, because we're used to thinking of Western or American, rather. I don't try not to use the word Western, American, or European democratic politicians as acting somehow in the interest of a set of ideas or, certainly in the interest of their country or what they believe is to be the interest of their country. And he will not do that. And that is why he could be extremely dangerous. And the deals that he could make could be very well be detrimental to American interests and maybe even to the global interests of the democratic world.
We had that conversation around the ambiguity on China, specifically with one of the people who might be his national security advisor, Elbridge Colby, last week, but also a while ago with Neil Ferguson, whose claim, and he's not the only one, a lot of people like Neil who are sort of hoping to at least that there'll be a sort of clear course on foreign policy out of a Trump administration, says, well, it will depend on who's in the room. And there'll be someone in the room who will be hawkish because the Republicans are hawkish. I guess in that context, I wondered, we're speaking quite soon after the selection of J.D. Vance as Donald Trump's running mate. What would the Confederation of Strongman Autocrats think about his selection as vice president? Do you think, is he likely to tilt policy further in that more autocratic direction in a second Trump administration?
So funny enough, what concerns me about J.D. Vance is not stuff that he says, which seems to change depending on what the political mood is. What disturbs me about him is the degree to which his candidacy was lobbied for by Elon Musk and David Sachs, who have very clear ideas, at least about Russia and Ukraine. And so what I worry about is that Vance is there because, Trump was essentially selling the vice presidency. I mean, who's going to give me more for it? What's the, and I don't know what exactly that means, but I'm not sure that his policies are as important as the group of business people whom he represents are or might be.
As the name of the book suggests, you are focused on the financial corporate side of Autocracy Inc. And one of the distinctive things about them that you highlight is that they are working together to not just to stay in power, but they have been very financially motivated as well. What kind of challenge does that present to those who are trying to combat this or undermine these autocrats?
One of the big differences between the autocrats of the current day and some of their predecessors in the 20th century is that these are individually very, very rich people. So either they are billionaires or their families are billionaires. They've enriched groups of people around them. That's one of the reasons why they stay in power. It's one of the reasons why they want power. It's one of the reasons why they hate the conversation about transparency and accountability and the rule of law so much, because the instinct that most people have about justice, that this is unfair. Why is our economy so opaque? they need to push back against that all the time because they need to protect their wealth and the wealth of their inner circle. How did they obtain this wealth? I mean, that's a long story, and I won't tell it all here. But partly it was by taking advantage of the loopholes in the Western financial system. So essentially, Putin came to power by stealing money from Russia, by laundering it in the West, and then by bringing it back in. And his story was pretty typical of a lot of people at that time in the 1990s. And he did so with the help of Western lawyers, bankers, partners, all kinds of accountants, all kinds of people. And one of the great challenges for the democratic world is, will we shut down that system? Can we stop enabling the theft of money from populations, whether it's in Africa or it's in Eurasia? Can we stop that happening? And can we draw a line? Both because it's good for those countries, but also because it's good for us, because the amount of dirty money washing around in our systems. Some in the U.S. is a special case where politics have become insane and very driven by money. But even in European countries, where it's not clear who has money and why, it's not clear who owns property in London. I mean, none of that is conducive to good governance or good public conversation or democracy more broadly.
One thing that has kind of quote unquote saved the West from itself, or I agree with you, the West is awkward, but liberal democracy from itself in the past, is the self-interest of the commercial class. At key points, there was a recognition that democratic norms were needed to make capitalism work, even if those norms also constrained individual capitalists from doing everything they wanted to do. I guess the question back to you is that there doesn't seem to be that rationale operating. There's something that's not working in the system. I mean, in an age of corporate social responsibility, we still have a lot of big businesses apparently not at all concerned about Donald Trump as a threat to US democracy, if that's what you think he is, and still continuing even to operate in Russia or countries allied with Russia despite the sanctions that we've seen. It doesn't feel like the self-interest of capitalists is quite moving in that direction as we have seen in the past.
So it depends what kind of company. These are often companies with global ambitions and sometimes bases who are hoping that a Trump administration will give them special access or special deals. So a little bit like in Putin's Russia or in Orban's Hungary, where people who are close to power get special arrangements. The foreign policy is made in their interests, or even sometimes the domestic policy. And there's always been lots of influence of business on democratic governments. I'm not going to say otherwise, but where the scale of it is different now. That doesn't mean that it's going to be good for everybody else. I lived in Poland over the last 10 years, and in Poland we had a kind of autocratic populist party that sought to capture the state and had business favorites, especially some of the state companies that they were using to reward their friends and so on. It was a disaster for normal companies. So companies that depend on the rule of law, that need a reliable judicial system, that need contracts to be recognized, that need the rules of the game to be clear and fair. When there's a system that encourages favoritism, it's not corruption necessarily in the old-fashioned sense. People aren't necessarily being given bribes, but
transactionalism, like you were talking about.
Transactionalism at a very high level. This might be good for people who are on the inside, and it might be really bad for everyone else. And I am actually surprised by the degree to which the U.S. business community hasn't fully recognized this. I mean, I know some have, but the degree to which this could be very bad for a lot of people, I'm not sure is understood yet. I mean, think about what we were just talking about, a transactional China policy. I mean, to a company that sells things in China or trades with China, I mean, you need a policy that's predictable, that you understand, that's based on, some strategy that makes sense. And if instead there's going to be a policy that depends on whoever Donald Trump is in the room with and whoever pays the most money to his political campaign or invests in some company that's close to him, then you're going to have a lot of trouble doing business. And having that kind of government, in the long run is bad for the economy. And you can look around the world at every single instance of it and see that.
Well, and it's funny you should say that because when we sat down, Bloomberg sat down with President Trump a few weeks ago, and he was quite explicit on precisely this point. We said, well, surely the tariffs, it could be bad for a lot of American business. He's like, anyone who has a problem with the tariffs, they should just come to me, like Tim Cook said to me. He's a smart businessman. He did a deal. Anyone can do a deal. And as you suggest, of course, if you're a small business, that's not going to work. Just thinking more about this, how to confront this and some of the things in your book about that. As you said when you were talking about Taiwan, there are these kind of central ideas being propagated by China and by the whole group in terms of the sort of information war, which is that democracy brings chaos, it doesn't deliver. To combat that, as Audrey Tang had told us in a previous episode, you need to prove otherwise that it does work. President Biden is probably the Western leader that's taken that most to heart and has tried to operationalize that, making it work for people and bringing work back to the US and all of that. Just doesn't seem to have worked.
I mean, the part of Biden's problem is specific to him, which is that he was not good at selling what he had done or explaining it to people. And some of that was, maybe I don't know who to blame exactly for it. Some of it was, but some of it may have been his age. He wasn't a convincing public speaker. His television appearances weren't convincing. I mean, to get across to millions of Americans through mass media, you need to have an outsized personality. I mean, whether it's Barack Obama or Bill Clinton, you need someone who can sell their message. And he was not good at doing that. And that's a part of the explanation. I mean, I'm sure you've had a million guests on who've told you the other parts of the explanation, which is to do with the ways in which people still feel shut out of the housing market. And there are parts of the economy that don't work for people. And of course, the other piece of it, and this I think is why he wanted to run for president again, is that some of what he did, you don't see the impact yet. I mean, you created the CHIPS Act, which is designed to create more high-tech jobs in the United States. When you pass it, that doesn't mean the effects of passing the law are felt 6 months later. I mean, they may be felt 4 years later. And so some of what he does, I think, hasn't had an effect yet. There are examples around the world that are also going to be relevant. I mean, so the British Labour Party just won an election basically arguing we're competent, we're going to manage things better. We have people who have experience in government and know about economics, and we're going to fix things. And their government and their legacy will rise or fall on whether people perceive that to be true. And of course, perception is partly about what people really experience in their ordinary lives, and partly it's about how it's communicated. But I mean, the Kamala Harris campaign is also going to be partly about, can she retell the Biden story? Can she convince people that she can make things work? So it's not that that's wrong. It's just that it, much depends on your execution and your explanation.
There have been Biden staffers over the last few years who've been exasperated that he wasn't giving more speeches about bridges. And I sort of felt like that probably it's probably not going to help that much to just be constantly talking about big infrastructure projects. But that was maybe part of it.
The other election that I had the chance to observe recently was the Polish election in October. And, I have a declaration of interest. My husband is a Polish politician, although he wasn't a candidate. How did Donald Tusk, who's now the prime minister, how did he campaign? He campaigned by going round and round the country for 6 months and stopping in small towns, big cities. I mean, he simply talked and met with people every single day. I mean, it was a genuine grassroots campaign because he had to get around their problem, which was the capture of the state media by the ruling party. But, any U.S. or European politician has a similar problem. How do you break through to people, and how do you link up with them, and how do you talk about the things they care about? I mean, you might have to spend a lot of time on the road. And that wasn't something that Biden could do. He didn't talk about the investments that were beginning. He didn't spend enough time on factory floors. I get it. He's the president of the United States and he's busy, but someone has to do it.
Some of this is not about economic outcomes, though, right? I mean, and that's what also comes through in the book. The sort of information war that these leaders are waging, has achieved is a sort of lack of identification with some of those democratic values, of feeling of, it doesn't resonate necessarily, the idea of a rule-based order. If that's what we're trying to defend, sort of democratic values, and people actually no longer see the value of it, or even, and particularly think the US is not a very good ambassador for it, having not necessarily respected people's sovereignty or always respected democracy. How does one get around that?
I can't give you a kind of 3-sentence solution, but actually, you know who's very good at this is the people I began the conversation with, the democracy activists of the autocratic world, reminding people of what happens when you lose your rights and what it's like to live in a state where you don't have rule of law. I mean, you know, in the US, we're getting a little closer to that. I mean, we now have judges in the system who people now talk about Trump judges and Obama judges, which is something, we used to hear in Poland, what kind of judge you got in your case would affect the ruling. That's already the beginning of a slippery slope in the wrong direction. And convincing people that this will affect their lives and it will begin to change what kind of choices they have is part of the argument. I mean, this is actually why, again, just to use the Polish election as an example, abortion turned out to be a big issue in Poland. Well, abortion was already illegal in Poland, but it was tightened further so that, in effect, many doctors would not help women who were dying. They had problematic pregnancies, and 2 women died. And when people realized that a decision made by judges, sitting in robes in some distant place, had led to, after a series of events, to the deaths of these 2 women, that created a kind of outrage. If Harris or people around her are able to connect changes in the judicial system to people on the ground, that's a way of explaining, what it is that you lose when you lose rights, when you lose the rule of law. It can begin to affect you personally. I mean, those words don't mean that much to people. You say judicial independence and it doesn't make people scream and yell and clap and cheer and run out on the streets. But when people begin to see the longer term effect of the loss of judicial independence, sometimes the mood changes.
You've stolen my last question, which was to be ending on a moment of a sort of some hopefulness in that you are in Poland, a country that has succeeded in, at least for the moment, turning a certain kind of tide against a more personal, more autocratic style of leadership. You won that election last autumn, or at least those forces won the election. Donald Tusk is now prime minister again. Do you feel like that shows that we can do more maybe than many people now think when they look at what the forces coalescing in the US and elsewhere? I
mean, there is no law of history. There is no rule that says we have to decline or democracy will decline or the 21st century is the century of autocracy. It doesn't work like that. That's not how history works. What happens tomorrow depends on the actions of a lot of people today. And there is always space for civic engagement. There's space for people to involve themselves in the political lives of their countries if they care about the direction that they're going. And I've always believed that. And I think it's more true than ever.
Anne Applebaum, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Summer Books Voternomics from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Stephanie Flanders. It was produced by Summer Sadi with booking support from Chris Martlew. Production support and sound design by Moses Andam. Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer and Sage Bowman is head of Bloomberg Podcasts, with special thanks to Anne Applebaum. Please subscribe, rate and review highly this show wherever you listen to it.